Hi, my name is Courtney Ostaff. Some of you may know me as Stuck in the Middle on Twitter, and today I'm going to talk about simplicity versus rigor in the online classroom. And I'm going to start with the fundamental idea that learning informs our teaching and teaching informs our learning, that we're going to work back and forth with this. And we're going to build our house of education with two pillars. One is planning and one is curriculum. So I want to begin with curriculum today. And there are three main kinds of classes where curriculum is relevant. The first one is a survey course. That would be, your general Western history from 1500 to present, or maybe fifth grade biology. Those are survey courses. Another one is a methods course where we kind of master facts and concepts and procedures. This requires a lot of rigorous practice. That would be your Algebra 1 or your Elements of Art and Composition or your expository writing. And then a third kind that I think gets overlooked is a remedial course where we must begin at first principles and work forward. These are designed to fill gaps. I teach one of these, preparation for pre-algebra, or you might see it as a conceptual physics class. Now, if you were lucky, you're using a complete high-quality direct instruction curriculum that meets all your goals and combines a focus on content with an instructional method that uses writing. Well, the rest of us who are not so lucky have to build this. And one of the ways that we build it is to kind of examine our priorities in education. One of my priorities in education is that content knowledge is an essential part of education. And so therefore, curriculum components from that perspective have three different kinds of knowledge. There's declarative knowledge. Those are your facts. That's the sort of thing that's good for memorizing. They're fairly easy to assess. You've got your procedural knowledge, which are sort of your skills. This requires scaffolding, and we tend to assess this through tasks. And then we have our experiential knowledge. Those are your hands-on activities, but these require extremely well-supported background knowledge. And so in an online class, we have to be careful to use these wisely. And then when we think about curriculum, we also need to think about the scope and sequence. And in this scope and sequence, it should emphasize declarative and procedural knowledge and experience. So a good curriculum will provide this well-planned scope and sequence of facts and skills to be covered over the course of the year, preferably with a lab manual. Now, when we talk about curriculum, there are two primary kinds of curriculum, and those are mastery and spiral. And in a mastery curriculum, each concept is taught only once, but thoroughly. Students are not taught the concept again. In a spiral curriculum, concepts are reviewed throughout the year with more depth of knowledge at each visit. So we come back at week 7 and week 13 and week 19 and week 25 and week 31, and we hit it over and over and over. Now, I will say that many U.S. curricula combine the worst parts of mastery and spiral curricula. For example, most math textbooks have a chapter on fractions. Students learn one particular kind of fraction per lesson, they take a chapter test, and they don't learn about fractions again until the next year. Now, while technically this is a spiral, this is not a useful spiral. I call these exposure curricula, and that is not what we're going for here. Other key things in terms of talking about curriculum is that we need to have different kinds of practice. And a problem in a lot of curricula is that practice is not spaced. Students only have 1 or 2 days to learn the concept. Practice is not interleaved. The homework may have 10 problems of type 1, and then 10 problems of type 2, and then 10 problems of type 3 in that order. And the practice is not varied. Homework is only on that day's concepts or procedures. And there's a reason for that. People don't like this intensive spiral curricula because spacing out practice means that students have to put forth more effort to remember. That interleave practice feels more difficult than mass practice. It seems hard and chaotic and boring. And varied practice loses that sense of mastery students get from successfully completing 10 problems in a row. But you should always choose a curriculum with built-in interleaved interval-spaced retrieval practice whenever possible. Now, most curricula has an emphasis either on the procedural or the conceptual, but not both. And while I appreciate conceptual understanding, what I'm regularly concerned with is, can my students do math efficiently and on grade level? I primarily teach math, although I teach other subjects. So procedural emphasis curricula tend to ensure that the topic gets done right, and they are my first choice. Conceptual emphasis curricula are also an equity issue. When I teach students with special education needs, fluency is a major goal. Students with working memory issues are helped by curricula that emphasize memorization of basic facts and procedures. Many students don't have the luxury of good working memory to rederive procedures or good executive functioning to focus through lengthy procedures. They need to be able to just do it by combining memorized chunks of processes and limited working memory. So, if you have a highly procedural curricula, you should supplement it with extra work on concepts, or vice versa, supplement a conceptual curriculum with extra work on facts and procedures. Now, when I search for a curriculum, I want one written by experts, not just any Tom, Dick, and Harry walking down the street. Experts understand the deep structure in a content area, and they organize knowledge differently, so we want their expertise when deciding what is important to include in class. So, for example, a non-expert who writes curriculum might wrongly interpret the slave narrative collection at the Library of Congress as accurate, truthful memories about life under slavery, and then they might use this to argue for a white supremacist interpretation of slavery, whereas an expert would have a deeper understanding about amateur interviews by government officials and be able to transfer that knowledge to correctly interpret the slave narrative collection as a distorted view of the past. So, when I choose a curricula, I want one where an expert has identified prerequisite pieces of knowledge and worked with an instructional designer. Now, instructional designers are experts in creating a useful sequence of instruction and assessment, and frequently an instructional designer can produce a knowledge organizer or a concise table with all the key vocabulary and concept knowledge and timelines and maps and everything that your students need to know. Now, teachers who have a curriculum might have the best curriculum in the world, but it doesn't work if the teacher cannot adjust it for students who don't have the prerequisite knowledge or who need extra practice, or maybe they already know the material. So, for example, I became a better teacher when I realized that the distributive property was an obstacle for my pre-algebra students. I changed my lessons and I added other items. So recognizing prerequisite knowledge is key to good teaching, even given high-quality direct instruction curriculum. So when I discovered what my students needed first, I layered complexity later. I thought about the ways I could explain it to them, and I decided how I wanted them to practice. And your curriculum should allow you to do that. Now, I am not a fan of an excessive number of hands-on tasks on an online class. But they are very useful. For example, many math teachers discard hands-on manipulatives by the 4th grade or so. But manipulatives are good through high school mathematics. Teachers can, in fact, instruct students in multi-digit division and multiplication with Cuisenaire rods. You can demonstrate the Pythagorean theorem with scissors and tape and some origami paper. And I can walk students through the derivation for the formula for the volume of a sphere with some kinetic sand and hollow geometric solids. So a general rule of thumb for teaching is to start learning with concrete manipulatives, move to visual representations, and finally end with abstract representations. And while this sequence is helpful for all students, it's especially helpful for students who learn differently. So a high quality curriculum will hook students with these concrete examples and identify key vocabulary. Overlooked very often is assessment. So professional test designers exist and they use high-level statistical analysis to create assessments. So bad assessments do exist. I have written some. I have also purchased curricula with tests on material that wasn't explicitly reviewed in the curriculum. So bad tests can have confusing questions, or they can be formatted badly, or they can test trivia. Assessment is a science, and having an expert write questions is better for teachers and students. So the other thing that we need to think about when choosing a curriculum is the appropriate level of difficulty. If it has a whole bunch of word searches and fill-in-the-blank worksheets, don't pick that one. Students spend way too much time on below grade level tasks, and they get bored, and then they what is the Beatles? Tune in, turn on, drop out. Do not seek out a curriculum that promises to deepen conceptual understanding by teaching through critical thinking or problem solving, because for most students, working to frustration level every day isn't sustainable. Instead, you need to choose a curriculum with a manageable amount of work, with sufficient repetitions to cement understanding into their little neurons, and at a high enough intensity to keep students focused on the topic, but not to frustrate them. Now, different ways to access the content are good. Does the curriculum have connections to real life? Are there non-standard problems or scenarios built into the curriculum? Is important vocabulary defined? Does it support literacy with background information? Does it include reading and writing across the content area? Does it acknowledge the contributions of women and African Americans and Indigenous people of color? Those are all signs of a promising curriculum. Now, I will tell you, I am aware that a whole bunch of teachers use Google and Pinterest to find their curricula, but just don't. Instead, look for people who have experience in comparing curriculum. Make friends with an experienced teacher. Ask them to be your mentor. Maybe, if you're lucky, a principal will assign you a mentor teacher. Reach out online. Twitter is a good place to make teacher friends. There are some useful websites for finding good curricula. There's the What Works Clearinghouse. There is Ed Reports. There is the Evidence for ESSA, that Every Student Succeed Act. Now, each of these has benefits and drawbacks, and my favorite curricula are not actually even mentioned in some of these, but they are good places to learn. Now, they can be intimidating websites, and not all administrators like teachers purchasing off-the-shelf curriculum. If so, you may wish to quietly purchase secondhand textbooks to help guide your teaching. However, note, it is a violation of copyright law to make copies of textbooks for distributions to students. So let's talk about that for a second. Why should you use a textbook? Oddly enough, when teaching online, textbooks are critical because without the ability to hand information to students during class on an as-needed basis, teachers and students need some way to share content. Online teachers can't easily photocopy sheets and hand it out in class. And even if teachers send out PDFs, many students cannot print them out. And most people prefer to read in paper. So in the end, giving students textbooks increases equity for poor students. And also, instructional design is a science with its own best practices. I'm okay relying on experts to do that hard work for me with clear learning goals and concept summaries and worked examples and model answers and concept extensions and independent practice. And it matters. For example, research shows that 4 consecutive years of a high-quality math textbook series can add an extra 4 years worth of learning. That means you get 2 for the price of 1, 8 years for 4 years. And teaching is hard work. Online teaching is difficult. It takes a lot of time. Make the best use of your time and get a textbook. Now, I have several other reasons, but we'll stop there. The other thing is that teaching online requires oodles and oodles and oodles of planning before school starts and significant amounts of dedicated planning time outside the school years. And so this planning time is separate from grading, from following up with students outside of class, from answering student questions, from modeling good practice within the course, and so on and so forth. So I have met first-year teachers who told me that their only instructions were to cover the standards. And if so, I would, at a quick rule of thumb, count how many standards you have and divide them by the number of instructional days. Now, let's talk about planning in particular. When planning, we should always make sure our students know what we want them to do. When teaching online, I provide a written posted schedule a minimum of 2 weeks in advance. I also repeatedly assign the same types of assignments, and this is true whether I'm teaching in a blended class or all online. I am not afraid to tell students what I want them to do and when I want them to do it. And research supports this. Instructor-directed online learning has a greater effect on student learning than collaborative instruction or independent work. So saith the U.S. Department of Education in 2010. So offering students a schedule well in advance also increases equity in education because it gives low-income parents who are often subject to severe time constraints. It gives them forewarning to plan for their child's device access, their child's internet access, and helps plan for them to have a quiet space to work, as well as time to seek assistance for concepts their child doesn't understand. Now, as a parent myself, I have a deep respect for those parents who have worked hard to make sure that their child is online and has logged into my class. Those parents have often moved mountains to make sure their child is available, has a device, has internet access for a live class. And often, if a student attends a synchronous class, many parents will have arranged a special trip just so the student can attend the class. And so when a teacher creates a last-minute assignment, they've thrown a wrench into the family's plans. Unlike homework assignments that might be completed at an after-school care center and tucked in a backpack to be turned in the next day, online assignments must be completed at home and then uploaded into the learning management system. This requires internet access, which is not always available at home. Nearly 40% of school-age children have no broadband internet access at home. Particularly in rural areas, high-speed internet can be hard to find and expensive. So even high-speed internet at home and a new device do not actually guarantee easy internet access. For example, students with good broadband often swap devices between siblings for synchronous session. Almost 80% of U.S. children have a sibling, and 40% have more than one. In addition, I often hear from my students that they've swapped the mobile hotspot with their parent for a synchronous session, or even that they've walked to another household to obtain internet access. So most families also have some kind of evening routine, but with a last-minute assignment, a parent must change the routine for the family to provide internet access, a device, and space for the child to work. Don't do it. Give it to them in advance and make all the work as offline as possible. Now, one of my favorite parts of Teach Like a Champion is the introduction. And in it, quote, he says, I quote, "Consider one unmistakable driver of student achievement, carefully built and practice routines for the distribution and collection of classroom materials," end quote. And so by limiting the number and types of assignments, online teachers could invest time teaching to the expectations and routines for those assignments and benefit from that familiarity all year long. And this is especially difficult online because we have limited contact time with students. We have to demonstrate in a synchronous or asynchronous class session. And because students are working by themselves at home, there's no peer reinforcement, so students learn the routines more slowly. Now, Harry Fletcher Wood has identified 3 key items for building a routine. One is repetition. It takes about 6 weeks to form a habit. And so all my students have an assignment due on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday all week, all year long. So by the third or fourth week, they've practiced enough that they're not quite so confused. 6 weeks into the school year, I rarely get questions about when or how an assignment is due. Context. Giving students context clues of dates and situations. For example, the assignments are always located in the same place in the LMS. It helps reinforce the habit. Rewards. As anyone with a small child knows, irregular, explicit rewards are the most effective. Because I want my students to work for intrinsic motivation rather than stickers or artificial bribes, I almost never offer rewards or extra credit. Instead, my students get weekly feedback on their assignment completion via grades, and if earned, they get my praise. Now, a teacher who is working online benefits by having fewer confused students. The more habitual the routine, the fewer questions students ask. Now, online teachers are not the supervisors of task completion. Instead, it's the parents. So in order not to burn parents out, teachers must create work written to the student. And this is a term of art. This is curriculum meant to be read by the student so that the student can understand the presented concept and complete the work independently without needing assistance from a teacher or a parent. When you assign work that can be completed without direct supervision, it is more likely to get done. So in the online classroom, set tasks written to the student. Don't assume a student has constant access to a device. Don't assume they have internet access. Don't assume they got a buddy to help them out. And don't assume they have significant background knowledge. And don't assume they have parent assistance. Everything the student needs to know or have to complete the work should be included in the lesson, including how long it should take, the criteria for success, an example or a model of good work. So, for example, one of my common assignments is an online written discussion question. I review it during orientation. I teach them where to find it. I give them the slides in PDF format so they can download it and print it out if they wish. I have another slide repeating the routine for the due dates. I have another slide giving examples of question response topics. I have another slide with a model. I explain exactly how I grade it. I mark it up during the synchronous session. I give the criteria for the rubric. I show them the rubric. I show them how the points are earned. And afterwards, when students go to complete the work independently, the directions are repeated in the relevant portion of the LMS. And finally, in the assignment itself, I have modeled and provided directions again. So at this point in the course, the vast majority of students can complete the work independently without asking for help and without needing to be online for most of the assignment. They only need to be online to copy and paste their work in the correct box and submit it. So you should make all work written to the student. Now, while everybody benefits from a classroom with a set routines, they are especially critical for students with special education needs. For example, students with autism often do better with clear guidelines and expectations. Students with ADHD often have difficulty with executive functioning, making plans and goals. And as many as 1 in 5 students suffer from anxiety, especially given recent world events. So predictability is very important for these children, and creating a predictable routine helps them be successful. Another key item is by limiting the number of assignment types, students focus on the content, not the context. For students who are new to learning online, figuring out how to do something may take up more of their attention than the content of the task itself. What's the password? Where should I click? How does this work? But students learn better when they're thinking about the meaning of the information, not how to use software. So you should provide a daily calendar. You should provide a weekly calendar. You should provide a list of assignments. You should provide estimated time for assignment completion. You should provide monthly goals. You should check up on those goals. You should provide limited assignment types. Now, knowing which tasks you're going to use makes it more likely that you will think carefully about them throughout the year. Different content areas do lend themselves to different tasks, like problem sets in math or map work in geography, and they should be carefully chosen for specific learning goals. But This sort of long to medium term planning forces teachers to be explicit about goals and expectations using a scope and sequence. And so that can often be used to estimate how long a particular concept should take to learn, which helps teachers plan more effectively. Now, when planning, we should make sure that all our tasks explicitly support the goal of the unit by reviewing the same information in different formats, such as discussion board questions or guided notes. Teachers should create assignments that promote content-specific background, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And this is true whether you're teaching in a blended class or all online. Now, when you're teaching online, you should use a full-featured learning management system to support teacher-student communication and teacher-assigned work. And so my standard of practice is to use modules to organize the course. I also use it to create the schedule of work for students, and this is true whether I'm doing it face-to-face or online. And arguably, the most common LMSs or learning management systems, I'm going to call them LMSs from here on out, are Blackboard, Brightspace, and Canvas, and Moodle. So in the big three, students can see which courses they're taking and an integrated calendar across courses. And many parents suddenly switching to online schooling last spring found that this multiplicity of websites and apps to be incredibly difficult to navigate. A single central sign-on across grade levels and subjects and schools and a single website is much easier for parents and students. And you want to make it easy. If you want them to do the work, make it easy for them to do the work. And so it should be accessible in multiple languages. It should give public information about alternate methods of contact, and students and families should be able to log into the website and easily reach a live human. The teacher should not be the student's IT support. They should not be the primary source of information about policies or services or contact information. That is administrative responsibility. So, one of the key things in an LMS and other systems is the course module. While teachers often think in terms of units and lessons, a module is different. Lesson plans are for the teacher, right? We make them for ourselves, and they're parts of units. That's great, that's lovely, but in an online class, the basic element is a module. If your course is a file cabinet, the module is the individual file folder. Those big three LMSs help teachers organize their course in modules, and that number of modules depends on the length of the course. But in my experience, and I have 20 years of it, the module is best organized on a weekly basis. Our world organizes this thing by weeks, so all but the youngest K through 12 students have an idea of how long a week is. Students and parents can plan by the week. Now this means it doesn't automatically correspond to a lesson or a unit, so you have to change the way you approach planning. Modules will contain all of the course content for students. Those files, notes, discussions, videos, class recordings, assignments, tests, quizzes, links, everything is in a module. And just like a file folder, it's labeled. So, two things. When you create any kind of digital student work, you have to lock it up just like you would lock up student work in a file cabinet in your classroom. Student data must be protected, and LMS provides you with ways to do this. And another thing is that you, by law, have to make your course content accessible. In fact, it's illegal to use public funds to purchase technology like ebooks that supplies inaccessible content. And an LMS will be automatically accessible for your students. Get one. So let's zoom out and talk about specific assignments. Memory work. Explicitly tell students what you want them to memorize and teach them how to do it. One of the easiest ways to do this is to have them implement a Lightner box. You can Google it. There's a whole thing to do with it. Problem sets. So whether that's your Spanish translations, your math sets, your comprehension questions, you can do all of this in an LMS. As much as possible, stick to the kinds of problems that you would use in a face-to-face class. Don't get distracted by shiny new apps or websites. If they don't have any actual proof that they improve student learning, don't use it. Never include using sort of visual reminders help support students. Dual coding in particular has particular relevance to the online classroom, as teachers can create significant quantities of material for individual use by students. Completing graphic organizers increases learning. While students are by themselves, guided notes are really important. Teacher-prepared handouts with carefully designed blank spaces for students to write information have been found to improve student learning, particularly in the younger school-age children. And they're especially good for students with special education needs. Don't forget to include those diagrams. But perhaps the ultimate thing that you do in an online course is written discussion questions. They are the number one thing. Supporting videos are extremely helpful because one of the underlooked things is that online courses have a huge amount of text. Carefully curated videos can help. Along with, your homework sets and such like, quizzes are one of the mainstays of an online course. And keeping in mind that discussions are a luxury item when teaching online, these synchronous class discussions, there are some best practices for synchronous class design. Journals are an underrated feature of LMSs, and while it's true that hands-on tasks are not easily done online, they can be an important part. And so throughout all of these, we're going to have students write, we're going to have them practice writing, and we're going to have them practice reading. And that will help us bring around to an assessment plan. Consider making a formal assessment plan. So when you do this, you're going to call out what students are supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it, how you're going to assess it, and what work earns a good grade, your rubrics or your models. And when you do this, you are opening the door to online learning for your students. Now, throughout this book, I've cited some research, throughout this presentation, I've cited some research, and you might find this helpful.